Welcome to World History. Last time we looked at the way that the ideas of the French Revolution helped to influence and basically kick off a revolution in the sugar island of Saint-Domingue, now called Haiti. Today we're going to look at how the ideas and events of the French Revolution kicked off a wave of independence in the Spanish colonies in the Americas, specifically focusing on South America. So, some things you should know about South America is, in general, it was settled by the Spanish, but as you hopefully remember, they first gave a level of local control to Spaniards coming over through the encomienda system, and at the same time, they tried to strictly control trade to ensure that Spain benefited primarily from all of this wealth coming in under a system called mercantilism. And so there were strict laws preventing these colonies from trading with each other. Everything had to go back to Spain. And the goal, of course, is to basically benefit Spain and not necessarily benefit the colonists. I have a basic description of the geography of South America here, which will play a part in our story mainly because, man, mountains dominate most of South America. So, by the end of this lesson, you'll be looking at why Latin Americans wanted to revolt. You'll be able to explain why Simon Bolivar was essential to the revolution. You'll look at why the mutiny of Cadiz led the whole thing to sort of turn and the revolutionaries to win. And then we'll look at why Bolivar's vision of Gran Colombia failed, and there is no United States of South America to challenge the United States of America in dominance of the American continents. So, as you hopefully remember from previous world history classes, on the one hand, the Spanish colonies were organized based on the encomienda system, as we can see in the top corner. Native Americans were forced to work in exchange for being taught Christian values. And these tracts of land were owned by Europeans who extracted labor from natives. And the reality was this labor was incredibly harsh and brutal, and the Native Americans died off in huge numbers. These colonies were dominated by this social structure, laying out the idea that Peninsulares, Spaniards born in Spain, and Creoles, Spaniards born in the New World, were on top of this structure. People of mixed race were in the middle, Native Americans and enslaved people were on the bottom. But unlike the colony of Saint-Domingue, in the Spanish colonial society, Native Americans still made up the vast majority of the population. After the diseases went through, Native populations stabilized, and there were still lots of Native Americans here. So, obviously, everyone who's not white in this system does not have as many rights and privileges, and so all of these people are already unhappy with the system. But after the American Revolution, the King of Spain reformed the system to give Peninsulares even more power. He was worried that these colonies would break away from him, and so he gave these government bureaucrats born in Spain substantial, basically unlimited power over this society, and locked out the wealthy the Creoles, out of government power. And so, whereas the Creoles used to be loyal to the Spanish crown, now at this point they're starting to become much more seditious, and many of them are thinking, like, why are we dealing with this system where we're locked out of power and Spain is restricting our trade? If we were independent, we could be making much more money and we could be running our own affairs. So now all the groups who are not Peninsulare are unhappy with the system. Then there's a massive Native American rebellion. A Native American leader who goes by the name Tupac Amaru claims to be the reincarnation of the last Incan emperor and raises the Native Americans up in revolt to crush the Spanish and to take back their lands. This, of course, freaks out a lot of the mestizos and especially the criollo, and especially the criollos. This, of course, freaks out most of the mestizos and a lot of the criollo because the Native Americans outnumber the Spanish by a pretty substantial margin. And if they end up taking over, they might go all Haitian Revolution and kill all the Spaniards, which is going to be somewhat problematic. So the rebellion of Tupac Amaru convinces even more Creoles that something needs to happen. And then the French Revolution rears its ugly head. As you hopefully remember, Napoleon, as part of his continental system, tried to stop all trade with Britain, but a number of people violated this. As he was marching across Spain, the Spanish resisted him, and so he overthrew the Spanish monarchy. And so, for all of these Spanish colonies, all of a sudden there's a power vacuum. The King of Spain no longer exists. And so, who's actually in control of these colonies? Who appoints the peninsulares? And why should we listen to them at all? A lot of people decided that no one does, and we need to set up our own governing councils to sort of rule Latin America. And this is a good opportunity for us to set up these sort of governing juntas, these councils, in order to rule our own affairs. And so this starts to happen. And even more radical elements, like the precursor to all these revolts, Francisco de Miranda, he was an American patriot, and he basically he had tried to overthrow the Spanish government several times before this. Finally, he's able to swing in, declare independence, and Latin America is free for a time. Then there starts to be a massive disagreement amongst people who agree that Latin America should be free, but disagree on who should have political power. So there's this divide between people who believe the central government should have power versus the individual states having power. And so they start a civil war between these two groups. And then, as that is happening, an earthquake hits the capital of Caracas, killing about half the population. Royalist forces, specifically in the church, start to argue that this is a message from God, and the revolutionaries are overthrown and the government collapses. But patriots and one of the young people who was associated with the first Venezuelan Republic, a guy named Simon Bolivar, does not give up from here and continues fighting. Yes, the Venezuelan Republic collapsed, royalists took back over, but Bolivar is able to recruit a small group of soldiers to to follow him. He moves over to the city of Cartagena, which we can see on the map here, which is still in Patriot hands, and he launches this lightning campaign known as the Admirable Campaign. He goes up the Magdalena River, launching, again, lightning attacks in order to overwhelm Spanish forces, recruits more troops as he comes, crosses the border into Venezuela, and eventually captures the capital of Caracas and frees Venezuela again. Simon Bolivar, for this, gets the title the Liberator. He was a young Creole aristocrat who hated the Spanish because he thought that their system was not beneficial for Venezuelans and that the Spanish court was foolish and all their practices were outdated. And so he swore an oath to free his country or die trying, and now it seems like he's done it. And so with that, Venezuela is again independent, but Bolivar, in his campaign, alienated a lot of people. One of the things that alienated people is he declared war to the death, which basically said that any Spaniard who does not join us will be put to death. And so his troops executed a lot of Spaniards who were trying to stay neutral, which created a lot of enemies. These enemies were eventually united together by a guy named Tomas Boves, who was able to unite a group of cowboys who lived out on the plains of Venezuela to fight against Bolivar. These horsemen from hell, or these forces of cowboys, then launched an attack against Bolivar, and his troops were routed by these legions of hell and were defeated. And they burned the capital of Caracas to the ground, and Bolivar was forced to flee yet again. He then was exiled to Jamaica and launched 2 more failed attempts to take over before Boves ended up dying in a skirmish, and Bolivar saw an opportunity. Bolivar decided that he needed to recruit his own army of cowboys, and so he traveled out onto the plains and he started raising an army of cowboys, because it turned out that these legions of hell, these soldiers from the Llanos, the plains and internal South America, weren't so much loyal to any particular cause. They just wanted to fight and loot things. And so Bolivar was able to give them a cause to fight for, specifically recruiting a guy named Jose Antonio Paz, who you probably don't need to know, but here's a picture of Paz riding a horse with a red shirt. He's going to become the supreme leader of Venezuela in the future. And all of these forces, and Bolivar is able to use this army very effectively to then drive the Spanish out, and the war starts to turn. The final event that shifts this whole thing is Napoleon is defeated, and Spain is restored. The king of Spain is restored to the throne, a guy named Ferdinand. And so Ferdinand starts to raise an army to go reclaim his territories. But he doesn't tell that army where they're going. And so as all these troops start to gather, a rumor starts to spread that they're heading to the Americas, which freaks all these guys out because, one, they've been fighting against Napoleon for approximately 10 years now, and they're pretty tired of fighting. And two, as we talked about with the Haitian episode, when you go to the Americas, Europeans tend to get diseases, specifically yellow fever, and then they die horribly. And so rather than probably 70% of them dying of yellow fever, they mutiny, they march on the capital of Madrid and overthrow the government. And so with the government overthrown, now there is no hope of reinforcements for the loyalists. And Bolivar is able to defeat the last royalist garrison at the Battle of Carabobo. And now Venezuela is free, as is Colombia, and he creates this new country called Gran Colombia. From there, Bolivar starts to launch an even larger campaign to unify and liberate the rest of Latin America. He moves down into what is today Ecuador and is able to liberate that after a grueling march across the mountains, which was obviously the Andes Mountains are incredibly tall, and so this was very impressive. And then he is able to unite with the famous Argentinian general, Jose de San Martin. San Martin's story is interesting. Unfortunately, we don't have time to tell it today, but just know he's an incredibly effective organizer. He liberates Argentina, then liberates Chile, and then moves up to start liberating Peru. And he and Bolivar eventually meet in Peru to discuss the future of Latin America. Unfortunately, they disagree about what that future should be, and San Martin decides that he's had enough, he's done what he's going to do, and he leaves, giving Bolivar control over pretty much all of Latin America. So Bolivar is now the president of an independent Gran Colombia. He's the president of a new country called Bolivia, which was created in his honor, and he's president of Peru. So he tries to unite all these countries together into this massive state he calls Gran Colombia. The problem is, although all these people were very grateful for Bolivar to liberate them, and in the moment they made him president, once it comes time to actually put together a country, they have very different opinions about who should have power, and no one's willing to be ruled from any sort of central place. And so you start to see rebellions, and then rebellions, and then rebellions. And so Bolivar then suspends the Congress. He declares himself dictator until these rebellions are put down. He starts traveling around putting down these rebellions, and all of this leads to a collapse in Bolivar's popularity. People start to rebel against him, and eventually he has to dodge several assassination attempts, once literally leaping out the window of his presidential palace and hiding under a bridge, until finally he gives up and he allows the other countries to break away, resigns the dictatorship, and goes into exile. Things get so bad for Bolivar that they actually declare him an outlaw in Venezuela. They strip him of his citizenship, and if he ever returns to his homeland, he is to immediately be put to death. All of Gran Colombia then collapses into all the countries we know today. And they are all dominated by military leaders who then seize power, then are assassinated, and then new military leaders seize power. And so Latin American history is dominated by these caudillos, these military leaders who hold power based on their strength of arms and rule until one of their rivals overthrows them and then seizes power. So hopefully you can answer all of these questions and you have a better understanding of why Latin America evolved into the countries it is today.